The county property portal showed my brother as owner of the duplex at 9:06 on a Monday morning. I was Rachel Keane, 41, a union HVAC technician in Milwaukee, and I had paid the taxes, insurance, utilities, furnace repairs, and my mother's medical copays on that house for 6 years. She had signed the deed to Mark 3 weeks earlier without telling me. I did not call to demand the house. I took the brass furnace key from my work ring, listed every expense attached to ownership, and stopped paying the ones that no longer belonged to me. The recorded quitclaim deed contained no life estate for my mother, no right of occupancy, and no written promise that she could remain in the lower apartment. It transferred the entire duplex to Mark for $10 and other consideration. The notary acknowledgement was dated January 29th. 4 days later, my mother let me pay the annual insurance renewal as though nothing had changed. I printed the deed at the public library because the county portal compressed the legal description on my phone. The librarian asked whether I wanted single-sided pages. I said yes, then stood beside the printer while the machine produced the document that changed the meaning of every automatic payment in my checking account. The paper was still warm when I highlighted the recording date. My first stopped payment was the March property tax installment. I did not spend the money. I redirected the same amount into a separate savings account labeled MOM, personal support. Then I called the insurer and reported a change in ownership. I asked what documents the new owner needed to submit, and whether my policy could lawfully remain in force after I no longer had any insurable responsibility for the building. The representative said she could not discuss Mark's coverage without his authorization. She could cancel my policy effective upon confirmation of the recorded transfer. I emailed the deed and requested written acknowledgement. At 11:23, the company confirmed cancellation would occur on February 18th, unless the owner arranged replacement coverage. I kept paying for my mother's prescriptions, groceries, bus pass, and supplemental health insurance premium. Care for her body was different from carrying Mark's property. That distinction became the center of everything that followed. By noon, I had a spreadsheet showing 6 years of expenses. The total was $71,438. It included property taxes, homeowner's insurance, water charges, furnace replacement, electrical work, roof patches, basement waterproofing, and repairs to the upper rental unit. It did not include groceries, medical costs, transportation, or the value of my labor. I had never kept the ledger to claim ownership. I kept it because equipment, taxes, and family promises fail when no one knows who last touched them. The brass key beside my keyboard had opened the basement furnace room when I was a child. My father filed one edge by hand after the original lock began sticking. The new high-efficiency system used an electronic service switch and a standard utility room key, but I kept the old one on my ring. For years, it meant I was the person who could enter when the heat stopped. That morning it meant access without authority had become unpaid responsibility. I worked 19 years in heating and cooling, mostly in schools, apartment buildings, clinics, and houses, where January exposed every deferred repair. Milwaukee cold does not care whether a family is ready to discuss ownership. A cracked heat exchanger produces carbon monoxide regardless of who feels underappreciated. Frozen condensate lines do not wait for siblings to reach emotional agreement. My training taught me to isolate a system before touching it, verify energy sources, identify the person authorizing the work, and record what changed. I carried that discipline into my family only halfway. I documented invoices but allowed authorization to remain sentimental. Mom called, I fixed the problem, and Mark praised me from Arizona. Everyone received the benefit of my competence without confronting the structure underneath it. My flaw was believing the capable daughter should prevent other people from feeling consequences. I paid a bill before Mom saw the late notice. I replaced an appliance before Mark had to decide whether to contribute. I used vacation days for medical appointments and told my supervisor the schedule change was no trouble. I called that love because love sounded better than fear of what might happen if I stopped. I raised my daughter Sophie alone after her father died in a construction accident when she was 7. She was 21 by the time the deed appeared, finishing a nursing program and working weekends at a rehabilitation center. Watching her become competent should have made me proud without making me useful. Instead, I sometimes tried to solve her problems before she asked. She was the first person who named the pattern. "You keep everyone from learning what their choices cost," she told me after I showed her the deed. We were sitting in a diner near the Union Hall. Snowmelt made dark lines beneath people's boots. I had ordered coffee and forgotten to drink it. Sophie read the first page twice, then asked whether Grandma understood she had given away the entire building. I said I did not know. That uncertainty kept me from treating Mom and Mark as equal participants. I had never asked to own the duplex. I had asked for a written plan. Every winter for 4 years, I suggested Mom meet with an elder law attorney, decide how expenses would be funded, and put any occupancy promise into a record. She said discussing death invited it. Mark said lawyers created conflict where ordinary families needed trust. Their resistance left me financing a structure whose future was governed by private conversations I was not allowed to hear. Dad bought the duplex in 1983, when the neighborhood still had a bakery with an apartment above it, and the factory whistle marked shift changes. He rented the upper unit to help pay the mortgage, and raised Mark and me in the lower. The front steps leaned slightly toward the sidewalk. The kitchen window looked onto an alley, where children drew hopscotch grids in chalk, until delivery trucks erased them. Dad did refrigeration work at a meatpacking plant. He taught me to clean a burner assembly before deciding it needed replacement. He stored furnace parts in coffee cans, and wrote model numbers inside cabinet doors with a carpenter's pencil. When his rheumatoid arthritis made small tools difficult to hold, I took over seasonal maintenance. The brass key moved from a nail beside the basement door to my ring. After Dad died, the duplex was 3 months behind on property taxes. Mom's Social Security and upper unit rent covered ordinary living expenses, but not the accumulated repairs he had postponed during his illness. I paid the delinquent amount, negotiated a water payment plan, and replaced a cracked heat exchanger before the first hard freeze. The furnace replacement cost $9,840. Mark sent $500 and told relatives he had helped install a new system for Mom. I did not correct the story because arguing over proportion felt petty while we were grieving. That decision became a template. He contributed visible gestures. I covered systems no guest noticed unless they failed. In 2020, I declined a traveling foreman position that would have increased my annual pay by nearly $18,000. The job required 4 nights away most weeks. Mom had begun missing medication doses and could not manage tenant calls. Mark said he would come home more often if necessary. He visited twice that year. I stayed. I did not tell Mom the promotion I declined. I did not want gratitude that made her feel guilty. Years later, when she described the deed as a way to reward the child who had preserved the family name, my hidden sacrifice had no place in her account. Unspoken labor is easy to omit without technically lying. Mark was 2 years older than me and had always been skilled at making intention resemble contribution. He sent flowers from Arizona on Mom's birthday. He called on Sundays and spoke long enough that she described him as attentive. When he visited Milwaukee, he repaired one loose cabinet hinge, photographed himself beside it, and spent the rest of the weekend meeting old friends. He owned a pool service business near Phoenix. The company grew quickly during the housing boom and struggled after he borrowed to add a showroom. He presented the expansion as proof that he understood property better than I did. My work involved buildings every day, but because I wore work pants and carried gauges, he treated it as labor rather than judgment. Mark returned in December, saying he wanted to become more involved with Mom. He took her to breakfast, drove her past Dad's cemetery, and asked whether she worried the house would leave the family after she died. Mom told him I might sell it to help Sophie repay school loans. I had never said that. Mark did not correct the fear. He said sons traditionally preserved a family name in property records. The statement would have sounded old-fashioned and harmless to someone who did not know what came next. Mom began asking for copies of the property description. She wanted Dad's death certificate and the old deed. When I asked why, she said Mark was helping organize papers. I reminded her that any transfer should preserve her right to live there and should be reviewed independently. She accused me of assuming my brother wanted something. On January 17th, Mark drove her to a title office. He said they were correcting the deed so probate would be simpler. Mom later told me the closer said quitclaim deeds were common among families. She did not ask whether common meant safe for her circumstances. She signed where Mark placed the tabs. The deed reserved nothing. Mark's promise that she could stay for life lived only in conversation. He accepted full title and allowed me to renew insurance after the signing. That concealment separated his conduct from Mom's poor judgment. I learned about the transfer because I checked the county portal before paying taxes. My union apprenticeship taught technicians to verify ownership or management authorization before performing major work in rental property. I had adopted the habit after a landlord disputed a boiler replacement ordered by a tenant. Every February, I checked Mom's parcel for tax status and liens. The system that protected my employer from unauthorized work exposed my brother's deed. At 2:14 that afternoon, Mom called about the upper apartment's water heater. The tenant had reported rusty water. She expected me to inspect it after work. I asked whether Mark had told her I knew about the deed. Silence lasted long enough that I could hear a television commercial in the background. "He only did what I wanted," she said. I told her ownership was hers to transfer. I also told her I would not continue paying or authorizing expenses for property Mark owned. She said I was punishing her for loving my brother. I repeated that prescriptions, food, and personal support would continue. Property bills would go to the owner. She asked whether I would let the heat go out. I said I would respond to any immediate safety threat as a licensed technician, just as I would for a stranger, and bill the owner or refer the work appropriately. I would not maintain the building without authority, reimbursement, or a written plan. Mom began crying. My instinct was to withdraw the boundary until she stopped. I gripped the brass key in my palm and let the silence remain. Consequence was not the same as abandonment, even when another person experienced both as loss. Mark called 9 minutes later. He said I had revealed my true motive by turning against Mom as soon as I did not inherit. I asked why the deed omitted her life estate. He said paperwork did not change his promise. I asked why he let me pay the insurance renewal after he became owner. He said the policy had already been budgeted, and family did not reimburse every shared expense. "There is no shared ownership," I said. "You recorded sole title." He told me daughters naturally helped their mothers, while property traditionally passed through sons. That was the mask fall moment. He did not believe my labor created a claim to the house. He believed my gender created a duty to subsidize it after he received title. I ended the call and emailed him the insurance notice, next tax due date, water account information, tenant contact, and a summary of known maintenance issues. I asked him to confirm where future property correspondence should be sent. The message contained no demand for repayment. It established the date responsibility became visible. That evening, Sophie and I reviewed my automatic payments. We canceled the property tax transfer, sewer payment, insurance debit, and monthly deposit into the repair account. We left Mom's pharmacy, grocery card, transit pass, phone, and health premium untouched. Sophie created color codes: blue for personal care, gray for property, yellow for items requiring legal advice. The separation made the pattern visible. I had been paying $1,184 each month before irregular repairs. Only $436 supported Mom personally. The remaining amount preserved an asset now owned by Mark. If you have ever been the relative everyone calls because you are competent, consider whether people have confused your ability with permanent consent. Write in the comments one expense or responsibility you discovered belonged to someone else after years of carrying it. Naming the category can be the first step toward changing it. The upper unit water heater failed completely on February 7th. The tenant, Mr. Delgado, called me because my number was taped inside the utility closet. He was 70, worked part-time at a church pantry, and had rented from my parents for 18 years. He did not know ownership had changed. I told him I could inspect for safety, but needed the owner's authorization for replacement. Mark texted that I should handle it and send him the details later. I replied with my employer's service authorization form and an estimated price range. He wrote, "You know Mom can't deal with this." I answered that he was the owner and could authorize work electronically. He waited 6 hours. During that time, I helped Mr. Delgado shut off power to the unit and arrange temporary access to the lower apartment's shower with Mom's consent. At 4:52, Mark signed the authorization after learning a local contractor's emergency price was higher. He paid the deposit by credit card. I replaced the water heater the next morning through my employer at standard family independent rates. Mom watched from the kitchen and said Dad would never have charged Mark for helping. I told her Dad never transferred a building to one child while expecting the other to maintain it. She said I kept making everything about the deed. The deed made everything about the deed because it changed who had legal control. On February 18th, the insurer mailed a notice requesting Mark's application. He had not responded to prior messages. Mom called me in a panic and said the house was becoming uninsured because I canceled coverage. I explained that my policy could not insure property I no longer owned or controlled. She said I had never owned it before. That was true, but I had paid as an informal caregiver with the owner's permission and expectation that the property remained hers. Mark's transfer removed even that relationship. He obtained replacement coverage 2 days later at a higher premium because the insurer classified the duplex as non-owner occupied unless Mom held a recorded life estate. Mark told relatives my cancellation had cost him money. He did not tell them his deed structure created the classification issue. On March 1st, the quarterly tax payment did not leave my account. Mark received the county notice. He forwarded it to me with one line, "Please take care of Mom's house as usual." I replied with the recorded deed attached and the sentence, "This is your property tax obligation." He posted a message in the family group chat saying I had abandoned our mother over jealousy. Cousins who had never paid a utility bill added heart emojis beneath Mom's response. An aunt called to remind me that houses were only things. I agreed and asked whether she wanted Mark's mailing address for the next tax bill. She said it was not her place to get involved. Family concern often ended at the exact point where involvement acquired a dollar amount. I did not defend myself in the group chat. I sent Mom a written monthly personal support budget, showing what I would continue paying. It included groceries up to $350, prescriptions, the health premium, transit, and 2 hours of housekeeping each week. I told her additional personal needs could be discussed. Property expenses had to go through Mark. On March 9th, Mark arrived in Milwaukee without telling me. He held a family meeting at Mom's kitchen table and invited 2 aunts, a cousin, and our pastor. I learned about it when Sophie saw cars outside the duplex. Mark told the group my financial retaliation placed Mom's housing at risk. He presented a list combining personal and property costs so no one could see what I had actually stopped. I brought my ledger, the deed, and the monthly budget. I did not sit at Dad's old place. I stood beside the basement door with the brass key on the table. Mark said documents were my way of avoiding the moral issue. I asked him to identify one personal need I had refused. He named insurance. I asked who owned the insured property. He changed the subject to family tradition. The pastor asked whether Mom had a legal right to remain in the house. Mark said his promise was stronger than any document. I asked whether he would sign and record that promise. He said lawyers would make it complicated. That exchange altered the room. My aunt stopped looking at me and looked at Mark. The pastor suggested independent legal advice. Mom became angry and said no one needed to treat her like a confused old woman. I told her independent advice respected her ownership decision enough to examine its consequences. The meeting ended without agreement. Mark paid the tax installment the next morning. He described the payment as temporary until I came to my senses. On March 16th, a supply line leaked in the upper apartment and damaged part of the kitchen ceiling. Mr. Delgado shut off the valve and called Mark first this time. Mark did not answer. He called me next because water was spreading. I responded as an emergency technician. I stopped the leak, verified no electrical hazard existed, and documented the damage. Then I gave Mr. Delgado the number for Milwaukee's tenant resource line and provided Mark's contact information from the deed. I did not authorize reconstruction. Mark called after I left and accused me of abandoning an elderly tenant. I sent him photographs, moisture readings, and 2 licensed contractor referrals. I told him emergency mitigation was complete and the owner had to choose the repair. He asked me to sign the contractor agreement because he was out of state. I refused to sign. Remote ownership did not transfer authority back to me whenever paperwork became inconvenient. The tenant asked a question no one in my family had answered. Who was legally responsible for making the unit habitable? Mark's name was on the deed. Mom collected rent. I had been managing repairs. The confusion exposed how thoroughly our informal system depended on me. Mark eventually hired a restoration company. The invoice exceeded what my union contractor could have charged, but that difference was the cost of his delay and distance. It was not evidence that I should resume free management. At the end of March, Sophie's supervisor introduced me to Tessa Wynn, a social worker who coordinated elder services. Tessa did not begin by assuming Mom lacked capacity. She asked whether there was coercion, whether Mom understood the transfer, whether basic needs were threatened, and whether she had independent counsel. I said I could prove concealment and risk, but I could not prove Mom had been forced. Tessa referred us to Elise Warren, an elder law attorney. Elise agreed to meet Mom only if the first appointment occurred without Mark, me, or any potential beneficiary in the room. She said advice about a gift was not independent when the people who might gain from reversal sat beside the client. Mom initially refused. She said lawyers would make her choose between children. I told her the choice had already been made in a recorded deed. The attorney's job was to explain what it meant. On April 4th, Mom attended the appointment because Mr. Delgado's repair issue frightened her. Sophie drove her and waited outside. Elise reviewed the deed, tax status, insurance classification, rent arrangement, and Mom's income. She explained that without a retained life estate or occupancy agreement, Mark held legal control. A creditor, divorce, lawsuit, mortgage, or sale involving him could affect the property. His spoken promise might matter morally without providing the same protection as a recorded interest. Mom called me afterward and asked why I had not explained those risks more clearly. I reminded her that I had asked for a written plan before the transfer, and she called it jealousy. She said I should have tried harder. I told her I could not force her to receive advice she refused. That was the first conversation in which I did not accept responsibility for both the warning and the rejection of the warning. Elise discovered that Mark had requested information about a home equity loan. The inquiry appeared in correspondence he left on Mom's printer after the family meeting. He wanted to use the duplex as collateral to stabilize his pool business. The lender required proof of leases, insurance, and income. His plan explained why he wanted title without Mom's life estate. A recorded occupancy interest could complicate financing. When Mom confronted him, he said every business owner explored options and that he had never completed an application. He insisted the equity would help preserve the house by strengthening his company. The reasoning was circular. Risking the house would protect his ability to own the house. Mom asked me to attend a second meeting with Elise. I agreed after Elise confirmed Mom wanted me there and had already received private advice. Mark was invited separately and could bring counsel. He declined, saying the attorney had poisoned Mom against him. Elise proposed 3 possible corrections. Mark could transfer the property back to Mom, after which she could create a neutral estate plan. He could record a life estate and written allocation of taxes, insurance, rent, maintenance, and borrowing restrictions. Or he could purchase Mom's remaining interest in occupancy under an independently valued agreement that funded secure housing elsewhere. Mom rejected the third option. She wanted to remain where Dad had lived. I did not ask for the deed. My proposal was a neutral plan. Mom would own the duplex during life. Upper unit rent would fund a dedicated property account. And after her death, the building would be sold through an independent process, unless both Mark and I agreed on an appraised buyout. Net proceeds would be divided equally after expenses. Neither child would receive hidden credit for caregiving or promises. Mom asked whether the $71,438 I had paid should be reimbursed. I said some costs could be considered in an accounting, but I did not want repayment to become the price of returning her security. The ledger's primary purpose was to show how the property had actually been sustained and why future responsibility required structure. Mark finally agreed to a meeting on April 18th. He arrived with no lawyer and a folder from his lender. He said everyone was exaggerating a routine family transfer. Elise placed the quitclaim deed, insurance notices, tax correspondence, mortgage inquiry, and my ledger in chronological order. She did not accuse him of fraud. She asked whether he would state in writing that he had no intention of borrowing against or selling the duplex during Mom's life. He refused. He said future conditions could require flexibility. Mom asked why his promise that she could remain forever was not written anywhere. Mark said family promises did not belong in public records. Elise answered that property rights existed in public records precisely because families, creditors, buyers, and courts needed to know which promises controlled the land. I put the brass furnace key beside the ledger. Its teeth were worn silver where Dad had filed them. "I will help Mom as her daughter," I said. "I will not serve as your unpaid property manager." Mark said my statement proved I wanted control. I asked him to identify the control I was requesting. I had proposed independent management, dedicated rent, recorded occupancy, and a sale process that did not favor me. He had requested sole title, discretion to borrow, and continued subsidy. The comparison made his accusation difficult to sustain. He then admitted he had planned to use up to $110,000 in equity if his Arizona business needed working capital. He said the loan would have been his obligation, not Mom's. Elise explained that the property securing the debt would still carry the risk. Mom's face changed before she spoke. She had believed the deed preserved Dad's house through Mark. She now understood it had converted the house into an asset available to his company. Mom instructed Elise to prepare a deed returning title to her. Mark stood so quickly his chair struck the wall. He said she was allowing me to destroy his future. Mom replied that he had asked her to risk her present without telling her. The silence after that sentence was not triumphant. A radiator clicked. Snowmelt dripped from Mark's boots onto Elise's carpet. He looked smaller, not because anyone humiliated him, but because the intention he had hidden now occupied the room in plain terms. He did not sign that day. Elise sent the corrective deed through his attorney after he retained one. The attorney advised him that litigating could expose communications, lender documents, and the circumstances of the transfer without guaranteeing he would keep title. Mark signed on May 2nd. Mom's deed recorded 3 days later. The reversal did not restore the old arrangement. I refused to resume automatic property payments until a written management plan existed. Mom opened a dedicated account where upper unit rent was deposited. Taxes, insurance, utilities serving common areas, and maintenance reserves came from that account. If expenses exceeded rent, she and the future beneficiaries would discuss contributions in writing. Elise prepared an estate plan that protected Mom's occupancy and required neutral administration after death. Neither Mark nor I became sole executor. A local trust company would manage sale or buyout. The plan allowed either child to purchase at appraised value with proof of financing. It also prohibited loans against the property during Mom's life without her independent counsel. Mr. Delgado received a written lease for the first time in 18 years. It clarified rent, repairs, notice, and emergency contacts. He said Dad had always handled things with a handshake. I told him Dad had also lived downstairs and answered the door. Written terms mattered more when the owner's family was scattered, and trust had already failed. I accepted a foreman position that reopened within Milwaukee. It increased my pay and placed me in charge of training 6 younger technicians. The role required fewer emergency house calls and more planning. On my first week, I taught apprentices to identify who had authority before beginning work. I did not mention my mother's duplex. The rule was useful without the autobiography. Mom and I began rebuilding through practical limits. I visited on Wednesday evenings and one weekend afternoon each month. I did not inspect the house every time I entered. She stopped leaving utility notices on the table as silent requests. If she wanted help understanding a bill, she asked directly and accepted that advice did not automatically include payment. She apologized for the comment about daughters owing more. The apology came after Elise asked her to write down what she believed each child's role should be. Seeing the expectation on paper embarrassed her. She had assigned Mark inheritance and me maintenance, then called the arrangement tradition instead of preference. I told her I could forgive the belief more easily than the concealment. She had watched me renew insurance after signing the deed. She said Mark told her disclosure would make me emotional before the paperwork was complete. She accepted his prediction because it allowed her to avoid my objection. That choice damaged trust even though she had not planned the mortgage inquiry. Mark blamed his accountant for suggesting home equity. The accountant later confirmed he had only listed financing options after Mark described the duplex as investment property he owned, free of family restrictions. Mark blamed the title office for not recommending a life estate. The closer's file contained a notice stating the office did not provide legal advice and recommending separate counsel. Each shifted explanation narrowed the place where responsibility could finally rest. Some relatives blamed me for not warning them earlier. I forwarded the January and February messages where they called my concerns jealousy. I did not attach commentary. Memory became more accurate when dates entered it. Sophie set her own boundary with Mom. She would visit and help with medical technology, but she would leave any conversation suggesting daughters or granddaughters existed to cover costs sons inherited. Mom accepted the rule after initially calling it disrespectful. Sophie said respect did not require listening to a theory that assigned her future labor. Mark's contact stopped for 4 months. When he resumed, he asked Mom for no signatures and made no financial requests. He attended Thanksgiving at her house under one condition Elise helped Mom formulate. Property discussions would occur only during scheduled meetings with documents available. The holiday remained a meal rather than a negotiation. The upper unit rent gradually rebuilt the maintenance reserve. We replaced the failing porch steps in August through bids reviewed by Mom and the trust company named in her future plan. I did not perform the work. A carpenter completed it, submitted insurance, and received payment from the property account. Watching someone else solve a problem did not make me less loving. Tessa helped Mom enroll in a city program that reduced certain utility costs and arranged a home safety assessment. The assessor recommended better bathroom rails, brighter stair lighting, and smoke alarms with sealed batteries. Those improvements supported Mom directly rather than increasing Mark's unencumbered equity. I paid for one rail as a birthday gift and labeled it exactly that. The brass key no longer fit any active lock after we replaced the basement door hardware. I cleaned it with a cloth, but left the worn surface unchanged. Sophie found a small shadow box at a craft store. We mounted the key above a handwritten label, Furnace Room, 1983 to 2025. Mom objected to the dates because she said the house was not a museum. I told her the frame was for my apartment, not hers. The key belonged to the years when access meant Dad trusted me to keep heat running. It did not need to remain on my ring as a permanent assignment. By the following winter, the duplex's finances operated without hidden subsidy. Rent covered most property costs. Mom contributed a defined amount from income. Mark and I each funded a small reserve contribution because we remained expected beneficiaries under the neutral plan. Contributions were equal, documented, and voluntary within the agreement. No one called my payment a daughter's natural duty. A boiler alarm sounded during a January cold snap. The property manager called the service company, authorized work, and notified us afterward. I was on a school rooftop replacing a failed unit when Mom texted that the problem had been handled. My first reaction was guilt. My second was relief. A system had functioned without requiring me to abandon my own work. The transfer back to Mom triggered tax and planning questions that none of us had considered when Mark presented the quitclaim deed as simple. Elise referred Mom to a certified public accountant who reviewed the gift, the return transfer, rental income, depreciation history, and the possibility that the county would ask questions about exemptions. The accountant did not dramatize the consequences. She made a list of records needed and identified which filings required correction. Mom had never reported the upper unit rent consistently. Dad handled cash payments for years. Then Mr. Delgado began writing checks after Dad became ill. Some checks went into Mom's account. Others were used directly for repairs. The new property account required us to reconstruct 12 months of income and expense, so the next return would begin from an accurate baseline. Mark complained that the accountant's fee was another cost created by my refusal to keep matters private. Elise reminded him the fee resulted from a real estate transfer, a contemplated loan. and undocumented rental activity. Privacy did not remove reporting duties. It merely postponed the point at which someone had to identify them. I spent 2 Saturdays sorting receipts at Mom's kitchen table. The process could have pulled me back into total management, so we assigned roles before beginning. Mom opened mail and identified payments. The property manager categorized current expenses. I explained repair records only when asked. Sophie scanned documents. Mark participated by video for 90 minutes and then said his business required him elsewhere. At one point, Mom held a receipt for a $3,260 roof repair I paid in 2021. She said she had forgotten the amount. I told her forgetting was understandable. Allowing me to cover it without a plan had been the problem. She wrote the figure into the ledger herself. The act did not reimburse me, but it ended the version of family history where repairs appeared through collective effort. The accountant recommended treating most of my prior payments as gifts rather than informal loans because no repayment agreement existed. I had expected that result. A ledger can establish what happened without automatically creating a legal claim. Mark looked relieved until the accountant added that future contributions should be documented and should not be assumed merely because a pattern once existed. I chose not to pursue reimbursement. That decision was not forgiveness of concealment and did not mean the past expenses were fair. Litigation over 6 years of mixed gifts, repairs, and personal support would have consumed money, time, and whatever trust remained with Mom. My goal was to stop the transfer of future responsibility, not convert every old furnace filter into a courtroom exhibit. Sophie asked whether declining reimbursement let Mark escape consequence. I told her consequence was not a single pool that had to be filled with money. Mark lost sole title, lost access to easy equity, paid expenses during his ownership, and lost the family's willingness to accept verbal reassurance. Recovering every dollar from Mom might have increased my account while weakening the security we were trying to rebuild. The distinction became useful in my work. One of my apprentices, Jamal, damaged a control board after skipping a lockout step. The repair cost the contractor $1,180. He expected to be fired and began explaining that another technician had rushed him. I asked him to reconstruct the sequence, identify the missed check, and demonstrate the correct procedure. He remained employed under additional supervision. Accountability addressed the risk without requiring maximum punishment. They created a long-term tenant discount, rather than pretending no economic choice existed. Mr. Delgado received notice months in advance and signed the updated lease. He said he appreciated knowing the number instead of wondering when generosity would collapse into resentment. That observation described more than rent. Hidden favors often become hidden claims. By documenting the discount, Mom could be generous without turning Mr. Delgado into a symbol in later family arguments. The property manager arranged masonry repairs in September. 3 contractors inspected the front wall. One proposed replacing more brick than necessary. Another recommended repointing only the damaged joints and matching the historic mortar. I reviewed the technical language at Mom's request, but did not select the contractor. Carla compared bids, references, and insurance. Mom approved the narrower repair. Watching the process felt slow. I could have called a trusted crew and solved it in 2 days. The slower method taught the building to survive without my private network. A system that depends entirely on one competent daughter is not a plan, it is a countdown. Mark visited during the masonry work and criticized the cost. He said his Arizona contractor could have done it for half. Carla asked for the contractor's license, insurance, travel plan, material specification, and written warranty. Mark provided none. The cheaper alternative remained an opinion. He later told Mom the trust company was draining her estate through fees. She brought the concern to the quarterly meeting instead of accepting it privately. Carla showed the management charge, services performed, and projected savings from coordinated insurance and maintenance. Mom decided the cost was justified. Mark disagreed but could no longer convert disagreement into action. Our relationship as siblings entered a colder stage. We exchanged birthday messages and updates about Mom, but no personal confidence. I grieved the loss of a closeness we had rarely possessed. Childhood memories can make distance feel like a recent injury, even when the adult relationship has been transactional for years. I remembered Mark teaching me to ride a bicycle in the alley. He ran behind the seat until I reached the corner, then let go without warning. I fell, scraped both knees, and chased him while crying. He brought me a frozen washcloth and sat on the porch until I stopped. That boy was real. So was the man who accepted sole title and expected me to pay the insurance. Memory did not require me to choose one version and erase the other. Mom wanted a family photograph for her 78th birthday. Mark flew in with his wife and 2 sons. Sophie came in her nursing scrubs after a shift. We stood on the duplex steps while a neighbor used Mom's phone. No one held the brass key. No deed appeared. The photograph documented one afternoon, not proof that the conflict had vanished. At dinner, one of Mark's sons asked why his father did not own Grandma's house anymore. Mark said adults had changed the plan. Mom corrected him. She said she had made a transfer without understanding the risks and had chosen a safer arrangement after receiving advice. Her grandson asked whether Dad had tried to take the house. Mom said no, then added that he had planned to borrow against it without telling her enough. Mark left the table. His wife followed. The rest of us sat with the discomfort instead of rewriting the answer for the children. Later, Mom worried she had humiliated him. I told her honest explanations could be age-appropriate without becoming character attacks. Mark's son had asked about a fact affecting the family. A vague story would teach him that adults protect status by obscuring decisions. Mark returned for cake, but spoke little. Before leaving, he told Mom she had chosen my version over his. She said the deed, loan inquiry, and insurance notices were not Rachel's version. They were records. Her use of that word showed how far she had moved from the day she called documentation jealousy. My foreman role became permanent in October. I supervised service across 6 public schools and 3 municipal buildings. The work required budgets, scheduling, safety review, and negotiations with administrators who wanted old equipment to last through one more fiscal year. I learned to explain risk without turning every recommendation into catastrophe. One elementary school had 2 boilers installed in 1967. Replacement funding was delayed, so we developed an interim monitoring plan with clear shutdown criteria. The principal asked whether I could promise the heat would last through winter. I said I could promise inspection, maintenance, and immediate response. I could not promise machinery would obey hope. That answer reflected my family education. A promise without control over the condition is reassurance, not protection. Mark promised Mom lifetime housing while preserving the ability to mortgage or sell. Dad promised the duplex would stay in the family without creating a plan that defined care, ownership, or succession. Good intentions had been asked to perform work that documents and funding should have done. Sophie graduated from nursing school in December. At the ceremony, Mom sat beside me using the handrail she had practiced with after her wrist fracture. Mark attended and gave Sophie a stethoscope engraved with her name. The gift was thoughtful. Sophie thanked him without pretending the property conflict had never happened. Afterward, she accepted a hospital position and moved into an apartment across town. I offered to help with the deposit. She asked for a loan agreement instead of a gift because she wanted clarity. We wrote one with no interest and a realistic payment schedule. My first reaction was that family should not need paperwork. Then I laughed at myself. The agreement did not diminish love. It prevented future memory from deciding whether the money had been help, obligation, or leverage. Sophie paid ahead of schedule and kept every receipt, perhaps because she had watched our family learn the same lesson at greater cost. Mom's estate plan included personal property instructions. She gave Dad's tools to me, his watch to Mark, and family photographs to both of us through digital copies. The duplex would no longer serve as the only vessel for memory. Elise encouraged her to write a letter explaining the neutral sale process, not to control our feelings, but to prevent either child from claiming a private promise after her death. Mom wrote the letter by hand. She acknowledged that Rachel had carried most expenses and care, that Mark had briefly received title, and that neither history entitled one child to bypass an independent valuation. She apologized for using tradition to assign unequal duties. She asked us not to turn the building into a test of who loved our parents more. I read the letter in Elise's office with Mom present. I cried for the first time since finding the deed. The tears did not come when I lost the imagined inheritance. They came when Mom finally named the labor without using it as a reason to demand more. Mark refused to read the letter for several months. When he did, he objected to the line about unequal duties. He said Mom had been influenced by therapy language. Mom told him the sentence came from her own memory of who paid bills and answered calls. He stopped arguing with her directly and complained to cousins instead. The cousins, having seen the deed and mortgage inquiry, offered less support than before. The neighborhood changed around us. The bakery became a coffee shop. A developer renovated 2 nearby duplexes and raised rents. Property values increased enough that Mark's original desire for equity looked more obvious. Mom worried the neutral plan might still force a sale she would not want after death, as though she would be present to want it. Elise helped her focus on the purpose: protect her housing now and reduce conflict later. We also considered placing the property in a trust during Mom's life. After reviewing costs and options, she chose a transfer-on-death arrangement combined with the independent administration provisions available under her broader estate plan. The exact instrument mattered less than the fact that she understood it, received separate advice, and could change it while competent. No single legal tool made the family safe. A life estate, trust, deed, or will can be misused if the person signing lacks information, or if administration remains concentrated in someone with conflicting interests. The protection came from independent advice, recorded rights, transparent accounts, and duties assigned to people equipped to perform them. Mark's pool business stabilized without the duplex loan. He sold the showroom, reduced inventory, and returned to service work. The outcome weakened his claim that risking Mom's home had been necessary. It also showed why immediate panic should not determine long-term ownership. Businesses can change direction. A 77-year-old woman cannot easily recover a home after foreclosure. He called me one evening and admitted the showroom had become a source of pride he could not afford. He did not apologize for the deed. He said he had believed borrowing against the duplex would buy enough time to make everyone whole. I asked whether he had planned to tell Mom before signing loan papers. He said he would have told her once approval was certain. That means after the risk became real, I said. He answered that I always made ordinary decisions sound like charges in a case. I told him ordinary decisions did not require concealing ownership from the person paying insurance. The line went silent after he hung up. Still, the admission clarified his thinking. He did not intend to make Mom homeless. He intended to control the timing of when she learned her home had become collateral. Control over information was the mechanism. The next winter, Mom's furnace required a major inducer replacement. The service company quoted $1,460 and documented the failed part. Carla approved the expense from the reserve. I reviewed the diagnosis after completion and agreed it was appropriate. No emergency call came to me, no relative announced sacrifice. The heat returned because a funded process existed. Mom sent me a photograph of the thermostat reading 71 degrees. Beneath it, she wrote, "Handled." That single word felt like a release. I used the extra time created by boundaries to mentor apprentices, attend Sophie's pinning ceremony, and take a 4-day trip to Door County with a friend. It was the first vacation I had taken without arranging backup for Mom's building. On the second night, I woke expecting a missed call. My phone showed only a weather alert and a photograph of Sophie's dinner. Rest revealed how much vigilance I had mistaken for personality. I was not naturally unable to relax. I had spent years attached to systems no one else was prepared to maintain. Once responsibility became distributed, my body slowly stopped waiting for every pipe, bill, and promise to fail. The family also had to learn that my availability was not the measure of my love. I missed one Sunday dinner because I was hiking. Mom said she wished I had chosen family time. I told her I would see her Wednesday as planned. She accepted the answer without invoking age, mortality, or everything she had done for me. Progress sometimes looked like a complaint that ended where the boundary began. At the duplex, the framed brass key became a conversation piece. Mom asked me to bring it for Dad's memorial anniversary, and we set it on the table beside photographs of him repairing the old furnace. Mark said I had turned a household key into evidence against him. I answered that it represented Dad and the work I performed after his hands failed. It did not belong to Mark's defense or my prosecution. We each told one story about Dad that evening. Mark remembered fishing at Lake Michigan before sunrise. I remembered him teaching me to test for voltage with one hand behind my back. Mom remembered the winter he slept in the basement after a temporary repair, because he feared the boiler would shut down. The stories distributed him across more than real estate. That was one of the healthiest consequences of the dispute. Once the duplex stopped carrying the entire burden of family memory, we could consider selling it someday, without treating sale as erasure. Dad remained in skills, habits, jokes, recipes, and the shape of our attention. Brick did not have to prove blood. 2 years after the deed appeared, Mom chose to move into a nearby senior apartment with an elevator and community dining room. The decision was hers. Her wrist had healed, but stairs tired her, and managing a tenant felt less appealing. The estate plan allowed the duplex to be sold through independent appraisal and open market listing. Mark initially asked to purchase it. The trust company required proof of financing and an appraisal-based offer. He submitted both, but offered below the appraised value, because he believed family history deserved a discount. I could have objected emotionally. Carla simply applied the written terms. Mark increased the offer to market value, then withdrew after calculating renovation costs. The duplex sold to a local couple who planned to live downstairs and keep Mr. Delgado as tenant upstairs. The closing statement paid taxes, commissions, repair credits, and Mom's remaining mortgage-free proceeds. The money entered a managed account supporting her housing and care. Neither child received a distribution while she was alive. On closing day, I walked through the basement one last time. The newer furnace hummed behind a white metal cabinet. The nail where Dad once hung the brass key remained beside the old door frame, although the lock had been replaced. I did not remove the nail. The buyers could decide whether it mattered. Mom signed the sale documents with Elise present. Mark attended by video. I sat across the room and answered no questions because none required me. After recording confirmation arrived, Mom said she felt lighter and guilty. Elise told her relief after selling a demanding asset was information, not betrayal. Mark and I eventually received equal residual shares after Mom's death 4 years later. The property no longer existed by then, so neither of us could stage one final battle over Dad's name on a deed. Her account records showed every care expense and distribution. The trust company sent the same packet to both of us on the same day. At her memorial, Mark said I had been right about the life estate risk. It was not a complete apology, but it was the first sentence where he named the subject without blaming process. I told him I appreciated hearing it. We did not resolve childhood in the church hallway. Sophie kept the framed key after I downsized my apartment. She hung it near her nursing school diploma, not because she planned to become the next family fixer, but because it represented the skill passed from Dad to me and from my example to her. She added a second label beneath mine: access is not obligation. I would not have written that sentence at 40. I would have believed access created duty, and duty proved love. The deed taught me that a person can be trusted with the key while still deserving a choice each time the door needs opening. A month before Mom moved, the property manager found a box of old utility receipts behind a basement cabinet. The earliest bore Dad's handwriting. He had calculated fuel use in the margins and circled winters when the upper tenant paid late. I expected the papers to prove that he had always managed the house alone. Instead, several contained notes thanking neighbors, relatives, and tenants who helped during layoffs and illness. The discovery corrected another family myth. The duplex had never been sustained by one heroic provider. Dad borrowed tools, accepted delayed rent, traded repair work, and relied on Mom's bookkeeping. Our family later compressed that network into the story of a man preserving property for his son. The receipts showed a more ordinary truth. Homes endure through accumulated labor, much of it unnamed. I scanned the pages for our records and gave the originals to Mom. She read them in her new apartment after the sale. One note said Rachel held the flashlight, age 11. She laughed because she remembered me complaining that my arm hurt. The sentence did not create a property claim. It gave childhood its proper scale. Mark asked for the box after Mom died. Sophie suggested we divide the papers by year and make digital copies for everyone. He agreed. That small cooperation would have been impossible, while the duplex itself remained a prize. Once no deed could be won, memory became easier to share. My union later invited me to serve on a committee, developing guidance for technicians, doing work in homes managed informally by relatives. We added a simple requirement: identify the legal owner or authorized agent before non-emergency repairs, document emergency mitigations separately, and never assume the person who usually pays has authority to approve permanent work. The rule came from more than my family, but I knew exactly why it mattered. Informal caregiving can disguise ownership changes, landlord obligations, and elder vulnerability. A technician should not become the person who validates a confused arrangement simply because a daughter answers the phone fastest. At one training, a young apprentice asked whether paperwork mattered when everyone involved trusted each other. I told him trust is most useful when it can survive clear roles. If asking who owns a building destroys a relationship, the uncertainty was already doing damage. I also changed my personal emergency rule. Before agreeing to help, I asked 3 questions. Is someone unsafe? Who has authority? What will happen if I do nothing today? Those questions did not make me selfish. They prevented urgency from attaching me permanently to every problem I could solve. Sometimes the answer was still to act. When an elderly neighbor smelled gas, I shut off the supply and called the utility without discussing ownership. When Mark later asked me to review an estimate for his Arizona air conditioning system, I said no, because local licensing and conditions mattered. Competence did not require universal availability. The most difficult boundary remained emotional rather than financial. Mom occasionally retold the deed story as a misunderstanding between children. I corrected her when I was present. She had made an uninformed transfer. Mark had concealed material plans. I had stopped subsidizing the asset, reducing those acts to sibling misunderstanding, protected peace by blurring responsibility again. Over time, she learned to tell the sequence without making herself either victim or villain. She said she wanted certainty, believed the son who promised it, and avoided advice because advice might complicate the promise. That account allowed regret without helplessness. My own account changed too. I stopped describing myself solely as the daughter who paid everything. I had chosen many payments without conditions because being indispensable gave me identity after my husband died. The family exploited that pattern, but I had also protected it. Admitting my need to be needed helped me avoid recreating the same arrangement with Sophie. When Sophie bought her first condominium, she asked me to inspect the mechanical systems. I gave her a written report, recommended contractors, and then let her decide. I did not call the seller, negotiate repairs, or transfer money without being asked. Watching her handle the process felt like standing beside a ladder without climbing it for someone else. She chose the unit, negotiated a credit, and scheduled the furnace replacement herself. On moving day, she handed me a new key and said it was for emergencies, not maintenance. We both understood the joke, and we both understood the rule beneath it. Caregiving had once meant preventing Mom from feeling the cost of any decision. That belief made my labor transferable, along with the house, even though my name was never on the deed. When ownership changed, everyone assumed responsibility could remain attached to the same daughter. The sentence that reframed the conflict for me was this: when ownership moves, responsibility must become visible, or the old caregiver becomes the hidden asset. Mark believed he had received brick, rent, and future value. He also believed the heating, taxes, insurance, tenant calls, and emergency judgment would remain mine because those tasks had become invisible through repetition. Stopping payment did not mean I stopped loving Mom. I separated care from subsidy so both could become honest. I continued the pharmacy card while refusing the tax bill. I drove her to appointments while requiring Mark to authorize repairs. That division looked cold only to people who benefited from confusion. If your family has assigned you permanent responsibility without matching authority, describe the first task you would place back with the person who owns the decision. It might be a bill, a repair, an appointment, a form, or the emotional labor of explaining consequences repeatedly. Your boundary does not need to recover every past cost to change the next one. Send this story to someone paying for an asset another relative controls. They may not need to sue for ownership. They may need a ledger, independent advice, and permission to stop financing a promise that excludes them from the document. Subscribe for stories where quiet justice does not require cruelty. I did not take my childhood home from my brother. I stopped allowing my wages and availability to make his ownership risk-free. The duplex survived because it ceased being proof of which child mattered most. Mom remained housed, the tenant gained written protection, and the brass key finally came off my ring.